Thank you for joining today's webinar on Do Public Sector Employees Really Live Longer? Exploring the data for normal times and in the age of COVID. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director of NCPERS. Today's program is part of our expanded Center for Online Learning. We're all adjusting to the new COVID reality, so please bear with us if there should be any technical issues or background noise during our webinar. And as always, your patience and understanding is appreciated. Today's presenters are from Club Vita, are Daniel Reddy and Eric Pickett. Dan is a pension actuary by trade with over 15 years of experience consulting to large pension, post-retirement, and post-employment benefit plans in the United States. Dan is especially interested in risk management, in particular using data-driven solutions to understand and manage risk. Eric began his career as an academic working in the UK and Switzerland as a math researcher and lecturer. He then moved into actuarial science, training as a pension actuary in London, working on a wide range of pension plans in both the public and private sectors. We encourage audience participation. Please submit your questions using the GoToWebinar portal. However, to ensure that we can cover all our topics today, we will hold your question till the last part of the program. Dan, Eric, I'll turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you very much. So today we're going to look at the question of, do public sector employees really live longer? And just in case anyone has any connection problems or internet problems before the end of the webinar, maybe we'll trail with the answer that we're going to be looking towards. So the answer we think is no. No, we don't think, well, at least not all public sector employees live longer than their private sector counterparts. The crux of what we're going to look at today is really that there is a large diversity amongst plans, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And there's a diversity amongst the individuals within those plans as well. And how do we best capture this diversity to calculate longevity and life expectancy differently for these people coming from different ends of the spectrum?
Thank you, Eric, and I'm Dan Reddy, and today we will be going through some details of research papers that we are publishing or have published in the last couple months. And here on this page, we have a little bit of contact details for ourselves. So what is Club Vita? Club Vita was founded in 2008 in the UK as a data sharing club for pension plans. So our subscriber pension plans come together, they pool their data into a combined large data set. We do statistical analysis on this data set, feed results back to our club members. We do lots of research, and we help all of our pension plans measure and manage longevity risk better. We do this as an independent data utility. We do not do any actuarial valuations. We support plans and their actuaries in risk management. So today we're going to be going through four main things. First, we're going to be reviewing some research evidence that we have found showing differences between public and private sectors in overall life expectancy averages. Section 2 is about how we're going to capture this diversity using our Club Vita framework rather than the normal frameworks. Section 3 analyzes the sector effects, public versus private sector effects, using a generalized linear model. And then finally, we're going to provide a little extra information on further benefits of using Club Vita's socioeconomic longevity framework with current themes like COVID-19 and how life expectancy is improving over time.
Thanks, Dan. So a brief summary as well then of the findings in the two research papers that we will be discussing today. First of all, we released a paper called Zooming In on Zip Codes just before Christmas. This looked at capturing the diversity of different individuals within US pension plans by socioeconomic factors. We're trying to really use the data that is held widely by record keepers of pension plans in order to capture differences in how long people live. We used factors such as the 9-digit zip code, pension amount, and occupation type. And using this in a generalized linear modeling framework, we could capture up to 8 years of diversity between different individuals within pension plans. We're going to be using this kind of framework, this idea of using different characteristics of individuals to capture diversity to study the public versus private sector debate. And the summary of our most recent research paper into this sector effect, the public versus private sector effect. So they're threefold. Firstly, that there is a large diversity of pension plans within both the public and the private sectors. Secondly, that studies that have showed different longevity patterns between the different sectors are heavily affected by the specific plans that are analysed. Changing the makeup of the data set, which plans submit data to these things, can have a large effect on the results of average life expectancies. And then finally, that socioeconomic factors other than sector, we find these are better for capturing this diversity. And once you control for these factors, then we find that sector has very little effect. So that's where we're going with our research today. Okay, so the first section we're going to be talking about is the differences between public and private sector pension plans. We're going to have a little look at some of the studies that have come before, so that we know what we're looking at here. And I would say the seminal text for me in the US to date has been included in RPEC's, the Society of Actuaries RPEC Committee's RP 2014 analysis. The Society of Actuaries went into that analysis with data submitted from both public sector plans and private sector plans, but they chose to only create mortality tables based from their private sector plans. They analysed the mortality experience from the public and the private sector and found that they were too different to include in one average table. So if we see the chart on the right here, this shows a ratio of public sector mortality rates by private sector mortality rates. The fact that the lines are below 100% for most of the direction means that there's lighter mortality in the public sector, which means there's a longer life expectancy on average in the public sector. The main reasons the Society of Actuaries sort of cite for not combining the data as well as the overall experience here is to do with gender differences. In particular, there is a bigger difference in life expectancy for the private sector than there is for the public sector. Amounts differences, they found there were higher pension amounts for the public sector, which skewed their results, and they found that there was some difference in low age mortality. We think, though, that these factors, whereas I definitely think this is a very valid reason not to use public sector and private sector data together to make an average table, we think that using our generalized linear model approach that we'll discuss later, that we can largely overcome these problems. The next piece of background evidence is an academic paper looking at the National Longitudinal Mortality Study here in the US. These academics studied longevity, life expectancy for the public sector and private sector using this data set. They found slightly longer life expectancy in the public sector, but once they controlled for socioeconomic factors such as education, they found that there was little difference. And moving over to Canada, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries have performed similar analysis to that ARPEC did in their RP 2014 study, and they find similar results, that there is longer lives in general, longer life expectancy in the public sector, however, that the data sets are not too aligned. Now we'll move over the pond to my home country, the UK. In the UK, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, which is I think the equivalent of the Society of Actuaries in the UK, and they have a subcommittee called the Continuous Mortality Investigation, or the CMI for short. This group perform a very similar role to the ARPEC committee here in the US. The CMI, as part of their recent working paper number 107, looked at the difference in public sector and private sector experience within their data set. So I forgive the technical terms for these tables up there. They are essentially the most recent mortality tables created in the UK from combined data from occupational pension plans. So the yellow lines in this chart are the mortality rates for the private sector divided by the average, and the blue lines are the mortality rates for the public sector divided by the average. So the fact that the private sector is above the 100% line means that it has heavier mortality or shorter life expectancies, and vice versa for the public sector. So on average, the CMI agree with the findings of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries and the Society of Actuaries in showing that on average, people in the public sector have shorter lives from their data set. However, the CMI did some extra analysis where they dug in a little bit deeper to what kind of plans and what industries were making up their data set. The red box here highlights the plans joining that data set from the public sector, and they split them into two separate categories. The local authority plans, they are equivalent to municipal government plans in the UK. And if we look along the lines there, the experience seen in the local authority plans, the dots there are to the right of the 100% mark. That means those plans have actually got shorter life expectancy than the average seen in the whole CMI data set. And then if we look at the plans labeled other public sector, these are public sector plans such as the civil service, the fire brigade, the police, so everyone that's not a municipal pension plan, a municipal government pension plan. And as we can see from those guys, they're on the left of the 100% mark. So they have seen quite significantly longer life expectancies than the average. So if the CMI's public sector data set was made up entirely of local authority pension plans, then we would be saying they have shorter life expectancies. If they're made up entirely of the other public sector plans, we'd be saying they have longer life expectancies. So some public sector plans have longer lives, some have shorter lives, but it really depends on which plans that are making up your data set. And this is the result that we see analysing our own data set. So in the UK, we have a data set that covers about 2.93 million annuitants. It covers about 1 in 4 of every pensioner in the UK that has a defined benefit pension. And it covers over 230 plans, and it dates back to about the data going back to the 1990s. Canada, we have a slightly smaller data set, but it does still cover 1 in 4 of all DB pensioners in Canada. It's made up from over 65 different pension plans with records on about 750,000 retirees. These charts show a summary of life expectancy in each plan. So each plan is a dot on this on one of these charts, each plan that makes up our data set. The purple dots represent private sector plans and the green dots represent public sector plans. The large dots are the average for each sector. And the chart is mapping male life expectancy along the horizontal axis and female life expectancy along the vertical axis. So plans in the bottom left of the chart have lower life expectancies. Plans in the top right have longer life expectancies. So if we look at the UK, we can see in our data set the average public sector life expectancy is about the same for women, and it's about a year shorter for men. In Canada, we see a different situation where the life expectancies look about the same for men and about a year longer for women in the public sector. But the real thing that we take away from these charts is how interspersed the purple and the green dots are. I've drawn some circles on here that show, purple dots around green dots. It's certainly not the case that we have an entire cluster of green dots together and an entire cluster of purple dots. So in practical terms, the average experience for the private sector might be more appropriate for modeling some plans in the public sector, and the average for the public sector might be better for modeling some plans in the private sector. So the conclusion that we make from this is that the difference in average life expectancy really depends on the plans in your data set. And we are driven to try to capture this diversity so that we can model the longevity for every plan in a way that is appropriate for that plan.
So how do we capture that diversity? I'm going to walk you through a little bit about how we think of longevity and our framework for creating a socioeconomic model. So what drives the diversity of life expectancies in those bee swarm charts you just saw? To look at the life expectancy of pension plans, you really need to look at what drives the longevity for the individuals that make up those plans. And it's really rather straightforward. It comes down to lifestyle, how physically active a person is, their tobacco usage, etc., affluence, occupation type at a high level, health, gender, of course. And the question we're working on now is, does employment sector affect how long someone lives? And so our baseline model uses, for lifestyle, it uses zip+4 or 9-digit zip code to get a very granular look at where people are living in the US. For affluence, we use pension amount. For job type, we use collar at a relatively high level for occupation. We're looking at whether a job is manual versus non-manual or blue versus white collar. For health information, we're not looking to collect any kind of personal health identifiers. We're looking to know if somebody retired on a disability pension versus a normal retirement or a normal health retirement pension. Gender is straightforward. And again, for sector, we're looking to see, does public versus private sector employment affect longevity? So at Club Vita, we pride ourselves on letting the data do the talking for us. And how do we do that? We use generalized linear modeling, which is essentially a linear regression against a lot of variables, all the variables you see on the screen now, to find out what of these variables is important, and then we determine the relative amount of importance of each of these variables. And so we come up with what we call the VitaCurves baseline model, which is a set of mortality assumptions that we use to capture that diversity of individual plan participants. So the diversity of life expectancy in those UK and Canadian pension plans that you saw on the bee swarm charts is able to be captured, we think, in our first generation US model, which has 8 years of life expectancy diversity for men at age 65 and about 6 years of life expectancy diversity for women at age 65. And looking at this spread, the number one factor that we find is most important is our measure of lifestyle, which is where someone is living at a very granular basis, the 9-digit zip code. So following that, it's pension amount, and then finally collar. And really what we would like to do is add another line to this test. We wanted to see if public versus private sector employment matters in the US. We can't do that yet. We'd like you to join Club Vita, and so we can prove that out and do some research here in the US. But what we're going to do is Eric is going to walk us through what we see in the UK and Canada, and our hypothesis is the US will be similar to those countries.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan. Yeah, so as Dan mentioned, so we just moved to the United States last year, and we have our the first version of our VitaCurves model is built just from single employer private sector to plans. We are currently collecting data for our second generation model, which will include plans from multi-employer plans, public sector plans, and single employer plans. And we plan to do further research to sort of look at our results in that setting. But yes, so for today we'll go through the results that we saw for the UK and for Canada. So how do we analyze a sector effect in a generalized linear model? So there's two ways to capture this public-private sector variable in our approach. The first way would be to stratify the data, to split the data up. So we start with all our data together. We separate it out into the public sector data and the private sector data. We then run two linear regressions on one on each of those data sets and essentially come up with a separate mortality model for the public sector and a separate one for the private sector. Now, this would have the disadvantage of splitting up the data. So each of our models would then be built on half the amount of data that we could have for the whole thing. So if there's any way that we can use these two data sets together, then that gives us a much more statistically credible model in the end. So the other way to capture the public or private sector effect is to add it as a covariate. So that means that we add it as one of the variables that we use in our linear regression. We see how the public-private sector factor affects the overall mortality alongside zip code, affluence, employment type. So we could keep all the data together. We just have to run a slightly bigger linear regression with more variables in it. So if we have the choice, that's the way we would like to go. But let's get on to which way we should go. So the first question is whether we should split the data or not. So the reasons to stratify the data like this are, well, there are two main reasons you would do this. First of all, if the covariates have a fundamental difference in meaning. So that means even if that somehow zip code meant something different to someone that works in the public sector than it does to someone in the private sector. And we think that this is not true. So even if benefit amounts have a slightly different meaning, even if there is higher accrual in the public sector or a tendency for longer service, we don't think this is a fundamental difference in meaning. This feels to me to be just a sort of scaling up or a scaling down of benefits that we could capture by introducing an extra covariate. The second reason to split the data is if the public and the private sector somehow give us very different shaped mortality curves. So on the right here, we give an example from our UK data of what two mortality curves that have significantly different shape are. We've used a logarithmic transform here just to turn this into a linear shaped graph so that we can understand the curves a little better. So this chart shows crude mortality rates for people who retire in normal health versus people who retire with a disability. The blue curve is the disability, and the grey curve is the normal health. And as you can see, around the ages sort of between 55 to 70, these curves have a very different shape. This leads us to splitting our data up for disabled retirees and normal health retirees. So we do stratify on that variable. But the question is, do we have similar shapes for the public and the private sector mortality rates? So these are the charts we have for the crude mortality rates for public and private sector in the UK, and the Canadian results look very much the same as this, but we decided not to show those as well. So the purple line is the public sector data, and the green line is the private sector data. So as you can see here, they have very similar shapes. So we feel justified in keeping the data together. We don't think there are any fundamental differences between these two sectors in the UK and Canada. So the next question is whether we should add public versus private as a covariate. So we've decided not to split the data. Is there any benefit in adding the sector as an extra variable in our model? To analyze this today, we're going to be looking at the Actuaries information criterion. This is a statistical measure that is used to assess the predictive power of each potential covariate going into a generalized linear model. In case you're getting a bit worried about the level of statistics that we're expecting in this talk, I'm going to cover everything you need to know about this criterion now, so that you'll be able to understand what we talk about. So it's a statistical measure that is used to predict the power of each covariate. It increases in magnitude for a model with a better fit. So we're looking for larger Actuaries information criteria for a better model. In addition to this, the criterion automatically decreases slightly in magnitude as extra covariates are added. This is to penalize overfitting, so that we don't just add arbitrary extra variables for no overall benefit. So the benefit of adding a variable has to be significant, otherwise the criterion won't show it up as being beneficial. And so what we have done is we have looked at the crude mortality rates from our data set, and we have analyzed what the benefit is of doing a one-factor model with each covariate that we're testing. So these charts show the AIC coming in from adding just one variable. So the large purple lines here are showing the benefit of adding of a one-factor model with just using a geographical address variable. So this is postcode in the UK and postal code in Canada, equivalent to ZIP+4 in the US. The blue bars in these charts show the benefit of adding just pension amount, using a one-factor model with pension amount. Occupation is the grey model, the grey bars. The green bar shows that you can just see on the UK women chart there, shows the benefit of adding public-private sector as the only variable. And for Canada, we also have an extra variable available to us, which is pension form, which is a proxy for marital status, whether someone retires with a single life annuity or whether they elect to have a spouse's proportion added. So that's the light blue bars. So the largest bars on here show the single most effective variable. And as you can see from all the charts here, the purple bar is the largest in every single one. So our longevity group, driven by address, ZIP+4, is by far the most predictive covariate for UK men and women and Canadian men and women. And the other noticeable thing from these charts is that the green bars are non-existent in 3 of them and very, very small for UK women, showing that the public-private sector variable has very little benefit as a covariate on its own. The way we progress through testing a multiple variable model, though, is after we've tested a single variable, we select the most effective variable for each group. So for each group here, the most effective variable was the longevity group, the purple bar. We then layer onto it testing each extra variable as well as together with the longevity group variable, and then we select the next covariate as the most effective second covariate. We then step through the model until we get through all of our covariates to work out the order in which we should add these covariates into the model. So the charts we have here show on the left is the most effective covariate, and then the next bar across is the next effective covariate, and it shows how we layer up our model to get the most effective model in the end. So for UK men, the most effective variate was the purple one, the longevity group driven by postcode. The second best variable then was pension amount that we added second. Occupation was the third best variable, and the public-private sector variable added a very slim slice of benefit on the end. So the summary of these charts are that for UK men, Canadian men, and Canadian women, the sector covariate added very little benefit. For UK women, the sector covariate did add some marginal benefit at the third covariate level. However, the effectiveness of this model really is driven by longevity group. The extra variables are adding a sort of very marginal benefit on the end. And if we only had one variable available to us, we would look to something else instead. So that's the conclusion of our research recently. So a quick summary of our findings then. So our existing research into generalized linear models has allowed us to see that there is a large amount of diversity amongst people and their life expectancy. And we can capture a lot of this diversity using different socioeconomic factors that are readily available to pension plans. ZIP+4, pension amount, and occupation type can capture a large amount of this diversity and can create models that we can really tailor longevity assumptions to the specific characteristics of people within a pension plan. Using this framework, we've also seen that there is a large diversity of pension plans within both the public and the private sectors. And we've shown that studies showing different longevity patterns, different average longevity patterns that is, between the sectors are heavily affected by the specific plans that have been analysed. And there's a worry for each public sector pension plan would have the worry that their plan somehow doesn't look like the average. And using our socioeconomic factors, we think that there are better factors to use other than sector to capture this diversity. And moreover, once you control for these other factors like zip code and pension amount, once you control for these factors, then sector has very little predictive effect on longevity.
So that is our that kind of concludes our public versus private sector research that we're publishing very shortly, and is actually available online on our website now for you. There's of course other benefits to using Club Vita's socioeconomic framework to model longevity. It's safe to say any discussion of longevity or mortality right now without addressing COVID-19 would be short-sighted. And so we want to leave you some food for thought about other applications of our framework to things like COVID-19, as well as how life expectancy is changing over time for different groups. We call these improvement scales. So COVID-19 is, of course, affecting all of us in the pension plan world. I'm sure at first operationally and on the asset bases, as well as the tax bases of different states and municipalities. We're working on what COVID-19 means for pension plans from a longevity perspective. Our strong hypothesis is that excess mortality during 2020 will depend on both the socioeconomic groups in your pension plans, as well as just the actual geographic location of your plan participants. So we think of COVID-19 excess mortality in two buckets. First, who will catch the disease? Of course, that's heavily geographic in nature, depending on where you're living, as well as population density, your nearness or how close you are to a travel hub like New York or Washington, say. And it also depends on socioeconomic status. Are you a frontline worker in the gig economy? Are you in high housing density areas? So you can see both geographic and socioeconomic factors are affecting who will catch the disease. And then once you catch the disease, who will be worse affected, needing hospital treatment, ICU, and possibly die, is going to be, or according to the studies we've seen so far, highly dependent on not only age, but also pre-existing medical conditions like diabetes, respiratory conditions, and lifestyle risk factors, things like possibly smoking, obesity. All of these things are definitely correlated with socioeconomic status. And so we're looking at different ways to model this right now. We think ZIP+4 is, it has the benefit of both, we've modeled the socioeconomics of those areas, and it identifies the geography, the specific geography areas in the US. So on the left-hand side here is a picture of our US longevity map. It is a very granular look at life expectancy areas. In this case, we pulled Virginia off our map. It was handy. And the different areas in pink have lower life expectancies, and the areas in green have longer life expectancies. And just comparing our map with the New York Times map of COVID-19 incidents, you could kind of broadly see that the more pink areas in our map are generally more orange on the New York Times map. And so we think there is some link, again, to socioeconomics. But there's also areas of our map that is yellow and green with higher life expectancies in just outside the Washington area that are definitely seeing more COVID-19 cases. So again, we think there's also that layering on of geography, which will affect who is going to be most affected in your states and your pension plans. And so, some of you may have actuaries that prepare experience studies on your plan's mortality. When you have a sudden event like COVID-19 that affects different socioeconomic groups differently in your plan, you may have demographics change suddenly in your plan, or at least the demographic mix of your plan will change. So we have an example plan. On the left-hand side here, we have a group that you're doing an experience study on that has had, say, 4 years of experience, 3.5 years of normal, and about half a year of COVID-19 experience. And so again, our hypothesis is that lower socioeconomic groups are going to be hit harder by COVID-19, in particular COVID-19 mortality rates. And so the danger is experience studies are retrospectively looking at experience over the last few years. If you go and apply the average experience of this left-hand group to a group of a new group of participants that have a different socioeconomic mix, you will you might have valuations that are further off than they should be, and you might be applying a period of experience for a different type of person if you're looking at averages. And so instead of looking at averages, we really think of longevity drivers. Again, as we've been talking about, our framework is to look at longevity drivers of individuals. We like to value participants as individuals based on their particular characteristics rather than looking at big average characteristics, because averages can change over time. And in this particular case with COVID-19, they're changing suddenly. Okay, and another place where our framework is particularly helpful is in analyzing how life expectancies are changing over time. So not everyone is seeing the same life expectancy improvements in the US and in the world. And the gap between different socioeconomic groups has been widening, in particular with the rich or well-to-do or the highest socioeconomic groups experiencing better or more life expectancy improvements than the rest. So this is a slide, or this is some research that we've done in the UK that has shown just that. And depending on, again, how your particular plan is made up of these different socioeconomic groups, your experience is going to play out differently over time. And so effectively, we think one size does not fit all, not only for baseline mortality, but also for improvement scales, or how that baseline mortality and life expectancy changes over time. So that was our research in the UK based on our data set. We would love you to join to be able to do this research here in the US. This is some research that has been done by the Society of Actuaries and by some academic resources that show really the same thing that we see in the UK, in the US, but it's just not quite fit for use for pension plans yet. But in general, what we're seeing is a widening of life expectancy between different groups, with the highest socioeconomic groups in the US getting the lion's share of life expectancy improvements over time. And our framework is going to be able to help you make sure the mortality improvement assumptions in your valuation are best fit to your population, and then your valuation is therefore the most accurate it can be. You'll have less bumps or spikes in contribution rates over time. So where are we going next? So the diversity of US pension plans is really driven by the diversity of its participants, as we've seen today. The simple approach of splitting plans into a public versus private sector, and then maybe having a couple of maybe subtype assumptions for teachers or public safety, is really not reflecting the full reality for these plans. The public or Pub 2010 Society of Actuaries tables has a life expectancy range of only about 4 years between, its most generous or long living teachers table and the short living public safety or general employee tables. Our model uses many more factors all at the same time, and is able to really capture more diversity for the pension plans in our club. And so we're building out our next generation models right now. We would love for you to come and be part of the research that we are doing, and you could see how longevity risk for your plans can be measured, and better managed with your plan sponsors. Okay. Thank you for your time. I think perhaps we will turn it over to questions.
Great, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Eric. There are some questions. So one is, have you ever looked at age at retirement as a variable? Meaning, if you retire earlier, do you live longer or shorter?
Yes, that is a great question. We have looked at that in our UK data set, and it seems the longer that you stay in work, the longer your life expectancy is. That it's a little bit difficult to unpick correlation and causation, though, I would say, because people who are willing to stay in work longer are probably those who are in better health to begin with. So there may be a slight selection effect there. But what we see from the data is that the longer you stay in work, the longer life expectancy you have.
And then another question is relative to public safety and education. They're asking, is the assumption that public safety is generally in the blue collar and education is generally in the white collar?
So generally, yes, that's how we would probably, looking at it at a very high level, it's sort of a manual versus non-manual type of differentiation. But in our next generation model, we are going to be collecting a little bit deeper information on occupation. We're not going to stop just at blue collar versus white collar. We are going to ask, are these participants teachers? Are they public safety? Are they just other white collar? And so we are going to do some research. Again, we're very data driven here. We're going to do some research to determine whether it makes sense in the US to add, say, a teacher covariate, for example. We're not wed to the approach that we've done in the UK and Canada. We think it'll guide our hypothesis, but the data will drive our answers here in the US.
And then relative to the difference between the public sector and the private sector, I think there's an assumption that in the public sector that there is, generally speaking, better health insurance. How does that factor into your analysis?
Yes, so that would be one of the things that we think would add to the effect of a public versus private covariate. So of course in the UK and Canada there are very different health services and health funding situations. So it may well be that that there is less differential between people in the public and private sector on health insurance. So that is one reason why we could see more of an effect of this coming through in the US when we look at this. However, I would say that the UK's national health system is widely widely championed by guys from the UK like me, but it doesn't provide the very high level of healthcare. It brings everyone up to a sort of base level. There are still people that invest in private healthcare, so there could be people from different employment structures that have greater access to healthcare there as well. It's similar to I think though that the Medicare in the US available for post-retirement could well have a similar role to play as the NHS in the UK. So whether having access to the sort of better high-end healthcare makes the big difference, or whether it's the kind of base level provided by Medicare that really provides the differential, will be a really interesting thing to look to. So as Dan said, we're driven by the data. We we have seen little effect for the public versus private variable in the UK and Canada, but the US is a very different country. So we're looking forward very much to doing this research for the US and seeing if there is an effect here, which, if there is, I think it will be largely driven by that difference in healthcare.
Great, thank you, Eric. Last question. In terms of the 9-digit zip code, is there enough population in the 9-digit zip code to get statistically valid results? Certainly, probably in the urban and suburban area, but how about in the rural areas?
Shall I take this one, Dan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yes, that's a very good question as well. So there are about 46 million 9-digit zip codes in the US, and we certainly don't have enough data on every single one of those to get a statistically credible model. So we have to group them together in some way to raise the amount of data that we have for each one of those 9-digit zip codes. So I think the most obvious way to do that would be to group them together into their 5-digit zip codes. Then you can have a lot more data covering each one. However, the thing that we're really trying to capture is a very micro effect. You know, someone living just down the street could have a very, very different socioeconomic background to someone else down the other end of the street. And we really want to capture these differences in sort of micro areas. So what we do is we use a marketing database that categorizes all the 9-digit zip codes in the United States into about 58 different groups for marketing purposes. So it looks at education levels, types of housing, composition of the household, whether it's a family living there or a single person, and a very sort of a big range of factors there. So once we group them into those 58 different groups, then we start to raise the amount of data that we have covering each group. It still doesn't give you statistically significant groups for each of those different 58 groups. So we then further cluster those groups together by different groups that have similar crude mortality rates. So we run a clustering algorithm to then group these things together. We end up then with about 7 different longevity groups based on address for the US.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for this great presentation. And I thank everybody joining us today, and I look forward to hosting our next webinar on Thursday entitled Balancing Headline Risks with Investment Opportunities in China. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.